Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. We are live streaming from our theater at the museum. We wish you were here with us, and we're working on that. We expect you might be able to join us live very soon and also still join us on Zoom, so wait around for that. That's going to be a great new initiative. Today, our Executive Director, Chris Costa, is joined by Christopher O'Leary, former U.S. Government Director of Hostage Rescue and Recovery. Chris O'Leary is Senior Vice President for Global Operations at the Soufan Group, which he joined following over 2 decades of working on counterterrorism investigations and operations for the FBI. Before leaving federal service as the Director of Hostage Rescue and Recovery, he led an interagency task force dedicated to the mission of safely bringing home Americans taken hostage abroad by a terrorist organization. He began his career with the FBI in the Minneapolis Field Office, serving as a special agent on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the JTTF, and as an FBI SWAT Operator. Over his career in counterterrorism, Chris O'Leary served in numerous critical leadership roles, including Supervisory Special Agent of the Al-Qaeda Squad of the New York JTTF, Unit Chief of the FBI's Elite Counterterrorism Fly Team, Assistant Special Agent in charge of the New York JTTF, and Section Chief in the Counterterrorism Division at FBI headquarters. He has extensive experience working on counterterrorism matters around the world jointly with U.S. Special Operations and Intelligence Community colleagues, as well as with intelligence and security services from our foreign partners. After Chris Costa and Chris O'Leary discuss the issues that are attracting their attention, we'll address your questions. Now, before I turn this over to Chris Costa, I want to thank the Iron Heart Warriors Foundation for their generous support of this program. Spy Museum board member Damon Walsh and his family have created the foundation in memory of Emmett Walsh to create and support training and educational opportunities for veterans and skilled construction tradesmen, with the aim of enhancing their ability to safely succeed and prosper in their chosen profession. Truly a very moving mission. We thank them so much for their support. Now, over to you, Chris Costa.
As always, Amanda, thanks for the great introduction. It is a distinct pleasure for me to have Chris O'Leary on board today for Spy Chat. Thanks to our audience. Thanks also to the Walsh family. We are super grateful that we are able to talk about Emmett, and certainly we are grateful for the support that we've gotten from our board member, Damon Walsh, and his family. So let me just dive right in to some of the stories that we're tracking. And Chris and I have spent some time together over the years working on counterterrorism cases, and we've become great friends. All of that said, he is also somebody I lean on to share insights with and to continue to collaborate on the kinds of stories we're going to talk about this evening or today. The first story that really got my attention in the last week was when Israel reportedly attacked a target in Damascus, Syria. The target was Iranians reportedly doing some planning, preparation. 7 individuals from Iran at a diplomatic facility on the embassy compound in Damascus. Iranians were killed in that strike. I don't believe that Israel has officially acknowledged it. That said, there have been multiple sources that have said that the strike points to Israel. So this has got my attention because Iran is under a great deal of pressure to respond internally to ensure that they set up an operation to seek essentially retribution and revenge, were some of the words that I've seen on some of their postings. But all of that said, the Middle East is waiting for what is believed to be an imminent threat in retaliation for that strike that took place in Damascus. So that's the big headline that I'm tracking, watching, and waiting for. The second story relates somewhat to the story of Iran, and this should be as familiar to our audience. In particular, we've talked about Iranian proxies, we've talked about Iranian surrogates. Let's review what we're talking about here. Iran has a forward defense policy, if you will, meaning they deploy surrogates and proxies rather than Iranian forces. Like who? Leveraging Hezbollah in Lebanon to fire at Israeli positions, tit for tat between Israel, northern Israel, and southern Lebanon, Hezbollah forces on the ground. Proxies that are aligned and trained with Iranians. So not Iranian military forces, but proxies on the ground in Lebanon. Similarly, we've seen that dynamic with the Houthis that are backed and supported also by Iran. So that is something we've been watching for some time, as with solidarity with Iranian interests. As a result of Gaza, we've seen Houthis in Yemen be disruptive in the region. Not to mention the fact that Hamas, who are Sunnis, not Shias, but they are still linked and supported by Iran. Even though ideologically they have significant differences, they are aligned with Iranian interests and have received support from Iran. So proxies continue to mobilize. This goes back to 1979 Iran. Maybe there'll be some questions from our audience and we can dig a little deeper. But there's been some excellent reporting from the New York Times on that. All right, changing gears for a second, we're going to talk in depth about the ISIS-K attack that took place, ISIS Khorasan Group, a group that came from the Khorasan province from Afghanistan. It is aligned with ISIS interests. It just committed an attack that you saw that took place in Moscow. ISIS-K was able to conduct that attack against a target despite the fact that Russia's intelligence services and security services were provided a warning, according to the media, by the United States intelligence community, consistent with our policies for a duty to warn even foreign adversaries that possibly terrorists are going to strike against foreign entities, which is exactly what happened in Moscow. So the question in one of the articles that really got my interest is, why did Russia's vast security services miss this particular early warning, miss the ability to thwart this attack? Well, first, we have to go back to review what Russia's been focused on in the last couple of years. They've been focused clearly on the external fight in the Ukraine. FSB is the internal security services of Russia, very much focused on counter-espionage, and now really putting a clamp on dissidents, maybe opponents like Navalny. Clearly, FSB would be involved with rolling up Americans like Gershkovich, who we'll talk about a little bit later, and individuals like Paul Whelan on trumped-up charges of espionage. So in other words, FSB has been very much distracted on different problems that are emanating from Russia currently, not really focused on the traditional problems that the FSB, the security services, would focus on, like the counterterrorism threat that you just saw play out on the ground in Moscow. The next story that got my attention, so transition a little bit to a U.S. counterintelligence threat. Not too long ago, you recall that an individual up in Massachusetts at Otis National Air Guard Base, an individual by the name of Texera, was arrested for espionage-related charges. He ultimately pled guilty. He used a social platform of Discord, Freudian slip there, Discord, and he posted some of the classified data on board while he was appealing to some of constituency that he built on a social media site. What happened in Alaska was very similar. An individual with the last name, I believe, of Clark was also prosecuted for posting classified, and I believe some of the sites that he was really engaged with were like the Boogaloo movement. You might remember the Boogaloo movement is focused on creating the atmosphere for a civil war here in the United States. In many cases, they have a white supremacist views. All that said, the Boogaloo movement was on some of the chat sites. This individual in the military posted some of the classified there. This gets to what Director Ray and I have talked about here in this very forum, the idea that there is hybridized threats, the idea that individuals committing espionage might continue to go and provide intelligence to the Chinese or pass classified to the Russian. Those traditional activities will continue, but also individuals now are shopping their grievances and finding social platforms that they can share their grievances with individuals that traditionally we weren't focused on. The United States counterintelligence folks weren't as concerned about some of the white supremacist groups in terms of counterintelligence. That dynamic seems to be shifting. So those stories have got my attention. I alluded to the fact that I am very concerned with the ISIS attack that took place in Moscow, because I think this is a harbinger of things to come. And again, we don't get hysterical at Spy Chat. We just lay out the facts as we see them. I'm going to share two articles that I wrote one, and I was a co-author with Colin Clark. Hopefully Colin is listening. We published an article with New York Times, an opinion guest essay, talking about the potential threat from ISIS-K. There's that group again, ISIS Khorasan province, emanating from Afghanistan. It seems that individuals from ISIS-K are branching out, and they're mobilizing for more attacks that took place in Moscow. Attack planning was disrupted around December and January, directed at a cathedral in Bonn, Germany, as well as some planning. ISIS-K in Germany was disrupted to go after, of all places, targets in Sweden. So ISIS-K cells are mobilizing for terrorism. There have been some threats this week. So I would argue that we have to pay attention to ISIS-K. We have to continue to pressure ISIS-K. And when I say we, that's the royal we. That's not just Western intelligence services, but partners throughout the world that are aligned to counter threats coming from terrorism, wherever they come from. So we can talk a little bit more about that. I hope there are some questions on that. And the last story that got my attention, this is an old story, but it's something we should continue to monitor. I think the Wall Street Journal this week talked about camps like Al-Hol in Syria, where there are some 44,000 detainees that are being kept in camps, to include hardcore ISIS terrorists that are being kept there, being controlled and restrained by Syrian Democratic Forces and other partners. But the fundamental problem is those camps are becoming an incubator for future terrorists. We recognized that in 2018. This is not a U.S. problem. This is not a problem exclusively for the West. This is a global problem. We've written about this. We've talked about it at Spy Chat. We've worked on policy and talked about policy. I worked on some of the implications of this back in 2018. But all of that said, this continues to be a problem, and Wall Street Journal just reported on it this past week. The last thing I want to do is advocate for a book this week. I want to advocate for a book written by Colin McCann and Diane Foley. Our audience is familiar with the idea that we are going to talk about hostages and wrongfully held detainees like Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan. Diane wrote her story and the story of Jim Foley and others that were captured and held by ISIS and ultimately murdered. The story is heartbreaking, but at the same time, as sober as it is, it's an important story. We're coming up on the 10th anniversary. I encourage anyone listening to Spy Chat to purchase the book. It's going to support hostages, and it's going to continue to get the word out on the seriousness of hostage taking by states that behave like terrorists, as well as terrorists that continue to take people's liberty away. So that's a lot. I'm looking forward to hearing from Chris. Chris, it's great to have you here. Over to you.
Well, thanks for having me, Chris. It's great to be here at the Spy Museum. It's an incredible space, and as you've mentioned, we've worked together over the years. Chris has been a mentor and guided me through some of the counterterrorism work that we've done together in the past, and it's great to be on stage with you now.
Well, thanks for joining us. What are the stories you're tracking right now, Chris?
Well, some of the ones you highlighted, I think, are extremely important. You know, the ISIS-K threat, I don't think can be underestimated, but I don't think it's simply an ISIS-K threat. I think it's indicative of the broader threat. You know, we've been engaged in the war on terrorism, to use that phrase, since post-September 11th, and we've done an amazing amount of work. We've done things incredibly well in some cases. We've had flawed strategies in other places, but unfortunately, what I think we've seen in recent years, because of a pivot towards great power competition and also a little fatigue from the war on terrorism, we're not focused on the threat anymore. We've withdrawn a lot of our resources from overseas, and you see the groups, the affiliates from Al-Qaeda and ISIS metastasizing. So in places like Afghanistan, where we have little or no coverage and capability there anymore, ISIS-K is growing in strength, and now they're conducting external operations. When you look at places like the Sahel in Africa, where you have failed states, semi-failed or fragile states, and massive swaths of ungoverned space, that's where terrorist organizations flourish. So we have Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb under the JANM umbrella, and ISIS, Greater Sahara, Greater Sahel, depending what you want to call it, or ISIS West African Province. They're just spreading like wildfire there. So if we go back to the ISIS core in Syria and Iraq, and everybody was concerned, you know, when they really started rolling across Syria and down towards Baghdad, they were only ever going to go so far. The Turks were going to, you know, protect the north. The Syrians, to a certain point, were going to protect things. The Jordanians, supported by the United States, and the Iraqis, you know, supported by us, they were compartmentalized. But when you look at the Sahel region of Northwest Africa, there is nothing that is keeping them compartmented right now, and they're starting to push into the littorals and, you know, really destabilizing the region. And there's little or no engagement by any Western countries to manage the threat. So what's happened, and you know, this ties into where great power competition and counterterrorism align and should coexist. Russia has pushed in to support local governments in Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso. They've created a number of coup governments. Wagner moved in there. So, you know, in the absence of a U.S. presence or the French withdrawal, Russia has moved in there and only made the problem worse. So I think that's one of the concerns that I highlight that ties into where the threat continues to grow.
So you and I have talked about this before, and it's worth sharing with our audience. Again, this is a common theme. We've talked about it with Director Ray and many of our guests in the past, but it's worth foot stomping again that we have continued to focus on counterterrorism, but in many ways we pivoted. And I don't like that word because I started hearing it in 2017, 2018. That the United States in particular is going to focus on great power competition. And I was concerned then, and I'm still concerned, that that's at the expense of counterterrorism, and we were going to decrement from some of the counterterrorism work, and we were going to pivot away, really, from some of the lessons we've learned. So these are the themes that Dr. Colin Clark and I shared with the world, really, in a New York Times piece. And I should also point out, in 2018, I wrote an opinion piece with Dr. Josh Geltzer, who's at the current White House, and we still share perspectives from time to time. He's a busy person dealing with a myriad of problems. But all of that said, we wrote a piece that we shouldn't celebrate a mission accomplished moment in 2018. And Colin Clark and I, here it is, 2024, Colin Clark and I, in our piece, warned that, again, we cannot take our eye off the ball because ISIS-K is growing. It has the aspirations to attack targets in the United States, although it might not have the capabilities. So coupled with what you just said, Chris, about Africa, we should be concerned. And I think that the ISIS-K attack in Moscow really got our attention.
Yeah, so I agree with everything you said, Chris, and I would highlight, I break it down to people on the terrorism threat, and again, that's all I ever worked, with the FBI and with our interagency partners around the world, and I did most of my work actually overseas rather than here domestically. But the threat is much worse than it was on September 11th. So the way I like to brief people is, and it's not this clean, but it's pretty close, that Al-Qaeda was roughly 400 Bayat pledge swearing members, mostly relegated to Afghanistan before September 11th. They're now roughly, the count's not 100% accurate because we don't have the collection to get a really accurate assessment, but roughly 40,000 members in 24 countries around the world. So the problem's worse, it's not better. ISIS has nearly a mirror image of that enterprise with their affiliates around the world. So the problem has doubled, and certainly, and now the axis of resistance, the Iranian proxies, the surrogates, have been mobilized. So with nobody other than CT nerds like myself really cared about Hamas until October 7th. It was something that was historical back to the Intifada and really an Israeli problem. But now Hezbollah, Hamas, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, and now the Houthis are really destabilizing the region. And we can't just pivot away from it and close our eyes and hope the boogeyman's going to go away. There are warnings and indicators that led up to September 11th, the East Africa embassy bombings, the Cole bombing, USS Cole, 17 U.S. sailors were killed, but yet we didn't take the appropriate steps to counter the threat. And the 9/11 Commission, biggest criticism was we had a failure of imagination. Well, you can't have a failure of imagination twice. We know what's possible if we try to ignore the threat.
And I think, just to interject another point, the director of the FBI recently talked about, I think back in December, blinking lights. That is a direct tie-in to what we heard about in the 9/11 Commission report, the idea there were lots of blinking lights, and yet no one was able to connect the dots. Today, that sounds cliche, but again, there are blinking lights currently. Those blinking lights range from what we just saw in Moscow to what the Germans saw with their arrests back in December, and we don't want to use the word conflagration. You see that in the media. You see that in some of the stories. There's not a conflagration outside of Gaza currently, but there are concerns that a war is going to widen. I hope that doesn't happen. But in light of the attack in Damascus, in light of mobilizing proxies by Iran, and I should point out, again, things tie back into the counterterrorism problems. Just last week, I believe it was last week, a separatist group operating in Baluchistan in Pakistan, the frontier with Iran, was attacked by Iranian forces. And then some of these separatist terrorist groups, the United States considers these separatist terrorists, attacked Iranian targets. That puts a lot of pressure on Iran to act. So an attack against Iranian targets by Israel, presumably in Damascus, pressure back home on Iran on their border with Pakistan, striking terrorists there. And then, of course, internally, they have to act, they have to retaliate in response. It just plays into this idea that the Middle East is unsettled, and we haven't even talked about Ukraine, or we haven't talked about China, but that all factors in to some of what many of the issues from a policy standpoint and from a security standpoint that are being discussed from here to Europe and elsewhere. Well, frankly, the president's meeting with the Japanese prime minister, I believe, today, it's security issues that will dominate much of those discussions, I suspect, to really counter Chinese influence in the region.
Well, I'll say two things. Number one, yes, the Middle East is incredibly unstable right now, and it benefits Russia and China to keep it that way because, keeping the United States embroiled in another 20 years plus of conflict in the region benefits our great power adversaries. So I think that's one point that's worth noting. I do not think, and I hate to use the word hope because hope is, as we always used to talk about, is not a plan, but I don't think that it's likely that the Iranians will strike directly at Israel. I think what they'll do is do something that is calculated and represents a strike. The Buenos Aires bombings at an Israeli facility, and also in the Balkans and Sofia, Bulgaria, they conducted an attack there. And that is going after Israel without actually attacking the Israeli homeland, which, the fundamental reason, and you touched on it in your introduction, that Iran uses these surrogates, these proxies, is defense in depth. They want to prevent an attack on Iran, and they certainly want to prevent the United States from getting drawn into an attack. And this really goes back to they don't want another Alexander invading into Persia and conquering, their kingdom. And that's why they make these marriages of convenience with Hamas, who's a group that they have no ideological alliance with, but it's useful. They really don't have that much of an ideological alliance with the Houthis, but they're a useful partner as well. But I think it the one thing that it triggers in my mind is there's a conversation going on in Congress right now about FISA authority, 702 authority, and whether it's going to be passed or amended. And I'll just add, the way we find out about a lot of these threats, whether on the Iranian intentions or whether on what some of the foreign terrorist organizations might be planning, is through the application of FISA. And I've heard people talk about, well, it's warrantless. Having drafted and utilized FISA's countless times in my career, it is a warrant. It actually goes in front of a judge. It is much more difficult to get than a regular criminal warrant because it is in a classified court. They go over the top to ensure that everything is done correctly. And and I understand the questions and the concerns to protect American liberties, but I'll offer one vignette, and I wasn't directly involved in it, but one of my good friends and my mentors in the FBI, Harry Samet, is the individual the special agent who identified Zacharias Moussaoui. Harry was a career counterterrorism agent and probably one of the most gifted people that the U.S. government ever had. Most people don't know him because he was not a whistleblower after 9/11. He just kept working cases and did great work throughout his entire career. But he tried to get FISA approved before 9/11 to identify what was on Zacharias Moussaoui's laptop. Before September 11th, FISA authority was not traditionally used on terrorism cases. It was only used on counterintelligence and espionage cases. So he didn't get it approved. Now, would it have stopped 9/11? it's unlikely, but it would have given us a better understanding of what was going on and perhaps mitigated pieces of it. So when people are arguing back and forth the utility of this, on balance against protecting civil liberties, take that into consideration. This is not just an academic exercise. It really disrupts real plots, and I've seen it over the past 2 decades, been an incredible tool. With it goes responsibility, though, and there have been mistakes in recent years, and being reflective and critical in the intelligence community is required to make sure that we are protecting the civil liberties that really our entire enterprise is here to guard against.
Chris, I really want you to have the final word on 702, so I appreciate that. You and I did talk previously about the director coming here in September of last year and talking about the importance of 702 and Dr. Josh Geltzer. So it is mind-boggling to us that collectively that we're still talking about these surveillance authorities, because they are a critical tool in our arsenal here in the United States. But thank you for that. Amanda, we must have some questions, right?
So many wide-ranging questions, so we'll ping pong a little bit. But first I want to mention, Chris talked about American Mother, and that the author of that book will be doing a live book signing at the Spy Museum on April 29th. So I just wanted to,
Thank you, Amanda,
to throw that in. And then we are all over the place in very interesting ways. One guest is curious about the attacks on embassies or invasions of embassies, from Israel's attack to the Mexican embassy in Ecuador. Thoughts about embassies? Are they sanctified ground anymore? Are they safe?
So they're supposed to be, and that's part of the international norms, and the United States, who helped create the current international order at the end of World War II with the creation of the United Nations in San Francisco. We should be taking a firm stance about protection of diplomatic facilities. If not, we do it so at our own peril, likely, because it opens up the opportunity for adversaries to go after our embassies. And what the United States certainly does not want is a return to 1979 in Tehran, but ignoring aggression against embassies, whether it's strikes by Israel or anything else around the world, I think we do so at our own peril, because if we cannot have diplomacy to work through some of the challenges around the world and some of the friction, and they are considered sovereign ground for another country, we're really violating the Peace of Westphalia, which
Right.
is what it comes down to.
Yeah, and I would just jump on there. Chris said it very well, but bottom line is it's sovereign terrain, which is why I believe I take a little bit of a different view than Chris. I think that Iran will directly conduct some kind of strikes, because they did strike U.S. targets in the aftermath of the Soleimani strike. They waited, they were patient, but they did promise revenge, and they struck U.S. targets and injured some 100 Americans, I believe, in northern Iraq, had PTSD in the aftermath, severe head injuries, et cetera, et cetera. So I think violating a country's sovereignty is very dangerous, and it sets a bad precedent, but it's happened for decades and decades. It continues to happen. Chris alluded to what a terrorist attack in Argentina. Certainly, terrorists don't respect embassies, and frequently they are targets of terrorists, as we saw in Benghazi, et cetera. The other point I want to make, I want to go back to Damascus again to ensure that I articulate why perhaps there was a calculus to conduct a strike, albeit, violating a country's sovereignty. At the same time, it seems that there were Iranians from the Quds Force conducting, perhaps planning. That was the reason the United States struck Soleimani on the ground in Baghdad, because he was presumably there to conduct some kind of planning with militia movements that would attack U.S. targets. We certainly don't know the intelligence, but that probably was part of the calculus.
Yeah, and I think that's a really fair point because, you know, if Israel could share, if they took responsibility for the actual kinetic strike, and if they could share the information that they had, that there were actual Quds Force members actively plotting, that removes the protection for the diplomatic facility. So that's number one. Number two, you know, under, just war doctrine, Israel has, the ability to, defend themselves. I mean, it kind of gets into a little, gray area. There's something called the Caroline Doctrine for preemptive strikes that you're really not supposed to violate. But if the attack is considered imminent and intentional, which it certainly would have been, it gives them the authority to do that.
Right, the inherent right to self-defense. What else, Amanda?
Yeah. Do either of you have thoughts that you're willing to share about the World Central Kitchen, losses of life on a humanitarian mission?
I can jump in, having worked counterterrorism and hostage recovery for the U.S. government in partnership with the Special Operations and Intelligence community. As a practitioner, I can say that the way that Israel has conducted their war, the strategy that they've utilized, is somewhat mind-boggling to me and to others from the counterterrorism and hostage recovery field. The approach that they've done from the early days, kind of this unbridled urban warfare, is, just from a practitioner standpoint, putting everything else aside, was not going to be effective at countering terrorism, at eliminating the group and going after the network and reducing them, which was one of their stated goals. And the second part, it was also not going to be effective at locating and recovering the hostages. And since we're half a year into this now and there's been limited recoveries, that certainly has proved true. Things like the horrific incident, with the aid workers being killed, those things can be avoided if you have very mature, intelligent professionals doing targeting on very specific individuals who are part of the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad enterprise. That's what the United States counterterrorism enterprise and our close partners have mastered over the last 2 decades. We do very targeted strikes, precision strikes with almost no collateral damage. Sometimes it happens, but it's not intentional. It's never intentional. But also intelligence-driven raids at night where the civilian population is not out and about, where we're going after specific individuals, gathering intelligence off the target site that we're at, taking detainees, conducting interviews, doing exploitation of and analysis of all the material that's been collected. All of those things eliminate the rest of the terrorism network in that area, and it drives to other targets and other opportunities for raids. So it becomes a cycle. You're doing it almost every night. Well, if that was done from the beginning, it would have reduced the Hamas enterprise, but also through that process, you start finding out where the hostages are. None of that has been done, which is why the war has protracted, which is why the hostage matter is still, a very difficult challenge to be fixed, and why negotiation is the primary tactic right now.
And just to put a finer point on it, the United States, anybody, frankly, waging warfare in accordance with laws of war, have a moral, ethical, and legal implication to ensure that non-combatants aren't killed on the battlefield. That said, battlefield is a complicated place. The United States spends a lot of time and energy focusing on minimizing civilian casualties. It is horrific that non-combatants and journalists are being killed with the numbers that they have been killed in Gaza. That said, I don't have visibility on the planning or the operations and the precautions that are executed by Israel, but it's something that obviously has caused problems with policymakers as well as the National Command Authority here in the United States. In other words, the United States is very, very concerned with the amount of non-combatants, civilians, innocent people dying on the battlefield in Gaza.
You're going to love this question because it's really something you can sink your teeth into. The term intelligence failure is one that makes many of us grind those teeth that we're going to sink into this. So thinking about Israel's failure to see the October 7th attack coming, Russia's failure to prepare for this recent attack on the concert hall. What do you make of these two cases of intelligence failure? And an interesting spin, another person mentioned that we failed to heed a warning about the brothers who bombed the Boston Marathon from Russia. Are we better at taking warnings now? So a lot to chew on, gentlemen.
You want to kick it off, Chris?
Well, I will say the intelligence failure for October 7th was catastrophic. Both the Shin Bet and Mossad are very capable agencies, but they were lulled into complacency and they weren't looking at a direct threat from Hamas. They didn't think they had the capability, despite the fact that every tactic that was actually used by Hamas in October 7th was used before, including the gliders, which was sensational. There were a couple of attacks in the 1980s, one of which was famous, November of 1988, I believe it was. It was called the Night of the Gliders, and the PFLP, GC, which is a different group, actually came across the Lebanese border and killed Israeli soldiers. And it's this, it's a point of pride for the Palestinian cause. Breaching of the walls, tunneling under, maritime assaults, all of that had been done by Hamas in the past and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It was just never done in a coordinated fashion at multiple points in a coordinated, combined arms attack is what we would call it. So you could have seen it coming. They were looking more at the West Bank than they were at Gaza, and they were caught off guard. With regard to the FSB, I think Chris kind of captured it pretty well before. The FSB has not been focused on counterterrorism. They were years ago.
Right.
Post 9/11, I actually worked a very high-profile case jointly with the FSB in the early 2000s, and they were excellent investigators. But they were focused on terrorism at the time because the Chechen jihad movement, led by Shimla Bisayev and Ibn Khattab, who were connected to al-Qaeda, had bombed the Moscow subway, had conducted the Beslan attack, massacring children, the Moscow theater attack back then. So they were very focused on terrorism. They were actually good partners with the U.S., which seems like forever ago now. But as Chris highlighted, they are focused on other things. They're focused on internal dissidents. They're focused on counter-espionage because of what's going on with the Ukrainian war. So that's an issue. With regard to Boston bombing, I'll push back a little bit. The United States intelligence community and the FBI in particular have done an exceptional job over the years mitigating the threat and disrupting a number of plots that if the U.S. Public knew, they would be incredibly alarmed. the agents in Boston that received the information conducted an appropriate investigation for the level of information that was provided and for the legal authority that they had to pursue it. They then went back to the Russians asking for additional information, which was never provided. So it's the constraints of not stepping over your legal authority is some way what allowed Boston to happen, which was horrific. But I don't know that I would categorize it as an intelligence failure. If it was, we would acknowledge it and we'd look to learn from it. And we have changed how, across the FBI enterprise, how they're called guardians, how they're addressed more thoroughly.
I should offer this. Chris was on the ground in Boston, the immediate aftermath of the attack directed at the marathoners that day. So I appreciate that. And I just want to put another point on the idea of strategic surprise. We talk about that here in the International Spy Museum. We talk about Pearl Harbor, comparing that to 9/11. When the smoke clears, we are going to discover, when Israel does a detailed dive at the information that they had, what was available to them, and they look internally at the mistakes that were made, they're going to discover similar dynamics to what the United States discovered in the aftermath of 9/11. They're going to discover the similar mistakes that were made in the lead up to the 1973 Yom Kippur War. So the idea of strategic surprise, the idea of vulnerabilities are classically a human problem. As long as human beings are involved, there are going to be mistakes, senses are going to be dulled, and we don't want to rely purely on artificial intelligence. But we're going to discover dynamics in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor were similar to dynamics in the aftermath of 9/11, similar to 1973, and we are and should be prepared that in the aftermath of October 7th, we're going to discover that some of the similar dynamics persisted and existed leading up to October 7th. So it's going to be easy to identify that the dots should have been connected. October 7th shouldn't have happened. Netanyahu should have been woken up. So we'll wait, and Israel has said they acknowledge this is a massive strategic failure in their intelligence establishment, but they're not going to do that deep dive. They're not going to assess what happened until the current war ends somehow, some way.
Very different, shifting to a different topic, the end of military agreements between the United States and Nigeria is weakening our security in the Sahel. Any recommendations for how to advance the negotiations between our capital and the capital of Nigeria?
So it's Niger, I think, is who they're asking about, because we actually have a pretty robust relationship with Nigeria. With Niger, it's complicated, and it's partly because we deferred to the French to take a leadership role in the region, because historically that's been their backyard. We have a finite amount of resources and desire to deploy around the world. So, we've let them take the lead, and unfortunately, over time, they were no longer welcome. Within Mali, Mali actually invited them in and then asked them to leave, and the situation has grown worse. Burkina Faso, I mentioned. Again, Russia is pushing in there and intentionally, because it gives them access to incredible natural resources that the Russians want. And also the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been pushing across the Sahel as well. The United States has somewhat been absent, and the way we have addressed the problems throughout the Sahel is, instead of regionally, we look to do it by each individual diplomatic post, which is really an ineffective way of addressing the regional challenge. There's open, porous borders there. The local tribes do not recognize the borders of the sovereignty, the spread of terrorism around the region in some cases is because of ideology, core ideology of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but all of the other human security issues, whether it's global warming, food scarcity, water scarcity, what's called the youth bulge, where massive numbers of young unemployed population with no options. So I point back to, the United States has the opportunity to come in there and try to address some of these issues, but you have to do it in a regional, comprehensive approach with our international partners. If you want to drive down terrorism in the area and promote stability, it can't just be doing kinetic strikes against JNM leadership or against ISIS GS leadership. And it can't also be doing nothing. Yes, there are coup governments in the area, but we have to figure out a way to partner diplomatically with them because, and I hate to sound coy, but if you're not willing to partner with a coup government in Africa, you might not have too many partners. But really, if we're the United States, we could carry out the Marshall Plan, not that many decades ago. We have the ability to take a leadership role and fix some regional problems if we do it, and I hate to use the term whole of government approach, but that's really what's needed.
So I'm glad, and I very much appreciate the question that came from our audience. I'll just offer this. 2017, October, I was at the White House. Nigerians were great counterterrorism partners with the United States. Special operators bled and died on the battlefield with Nigerian partners that were also killed. Since then, as Chris alluded to, there's been a coup. There have been some problems with governance in Niger, and the United States doesn't have a presence there. It is unfortunate because the population, Nigerians, the average person that wants to get food at a marketplace, they're the ones that are going to be threatened by jihadists that operate in the region. Similarly, although we're talking about Nigeria was mentioned. Hundreds of young schoolgirls are kidnapped in Nigeria by, again, jihadists or Boko Haram or hybrid organizations under the banner of different jihadist groups. So Africa is going to continue to be a problem. But earlier on, Chris used the word vacuum. And there's this conventional wisdom in this business that if there's a vacuum, somebody will fill that void. And in Niger, it's going to be jihadists. In Syria, in many cases, it's going to be in some parts of Syria, it's going to be ISIS, remnants of ISIS growing from an underground movement. At the same time, Russia's going to operate in that space. Iranians are going to fill that space. So this is something policymakers have to continue to watch, and certainly intelligence requirements are going to try to cover down on these threats as they come from Africa to Syria to the rest of the globe, frankly.
Well, I think one thing that I'll highlight, which plays into a couple of the questions that were asked, is remembering the past and learning, from mistakes that we've made or what could happen. So when we don't address the threat properly, we get the East Africa embassy bombings, we get the Cole bombing. More recently, although it's a little bit ago, but in Libya, the Benghazi attack, where U.S. ambassador and three agency and State Department personnel were killed. If we ignore the threat, something bad will happen. We have to address it in a smart way and look at different strategies that are not going to make the problem worse, but start addressing them appropriately. And that also comes into, the conversation about, the leak of the information on Discord, to the Boogaloo movement. If we try to ignore what's going on domestically as well, that turns into the Oklahoma City bombing. That built from Ruby Ridge to Waco to Oklahoma City bombing. And that's the pathway that you're on if you don't take the appropriate measures to try to mitigate it.
Thanks, Chris.
Regarding the FBI's recent arrest of Alexander Mercurio, in Idaho for his support to ISIS. How significant is Salafist influence on Western lone wolves?
I will say it's persistent. I don't want to alarm the public, but unfortunately, across the 56 field offices of the FBI, every field office has a Joint Terrorism Task Force for a reason, because not only the international terrorism threat remains persistent, the strength of the message remains and resonates with a lot of people, but now, in recent years, we have this domestic terrorism problem as well, where, nearly half of all FBI counterterrorism cases now are domestic terrorism cases. So, as I talked about earlier, the size of the international terrorism problem has grown, but we've had to split off a great number of resources and capabilities to address the problem building here at home, which varies from accelerationists to anti-government movements to white supremacy movements and hybrids. And then there's one thing which I still can't completely explain, but you have individuals who are susceptible for whatever reason, and they go looking for ideologies, looking for things that resonate with them because of a grievance that they have. So they may attach to ISIS. They may attach to the Proud Boys. In some cases, there's a hybrid of some of it because pieces of each will resonate with them. So you will see very strange postings of somebody who has an ISIS flag and a swastika behind them, which, I really don't know how to explain that, but it's, the term that some people have thrown around, it's the salad bar of ideology shopping, and it's more common than you think, and it's actually very common in the gaming community, and it's one thing that the FBI and our other counterterrorism and intelligence partners spend a lot of time trying to understand, so we can get ahead of the threat on that.
I want to try to squeeze in the very first question that came in, because it has a little bit of a pop culture connection. I always like to end on, I don't know, about a lighter note. This is such heavy stuff, but it is very interesting. This person is asking if either of you have ever experienced anything with a hostage, since you're both people very familiar with this topic. Any chance you've ever met a hostage that has been turned when they came home?
Well, I haven't personally met a hostage that's been turned, but I think perhaps what our guest is alluding to is this idea of what they call the Stockholm Syndrome, the idea that an individual that can have a certain identification with her captors or his captors. That's happened in history. I will say, and I want to be cautious here for our audience, I'm not suggesting that the individual was turned in any way, shape, or form, but an individual, an American by the name of King, and an Australian, I believe his last name was Weeks, they were both traded out. They were held by Taliban or a criminal group or the Haqqanis. I forget the details. During my time at the White House, we were certainly looking for solutions to bring them home. In the case of Weeks, he strongly identified with the Taliban ideology as he was repatriated to Australia. And frankly, that was his decision to make. So that is an example. I hope I answered the audience member's question. It's a great question. So I wouldn't say he was turned. I think he developed an ideological or cultural affinity with his captors for whatever reason. I pass no judgment on that. At the end of the day, he was released in Doha, and if I'm not mistaken, he went back to Afghanistan for a time, right?
He did. He was exchanged for Anas Haqqani and actually returned.
Right.
Some of the, without getting into any specifics, some of the folks, some of the hostages that are taken hostage are in some of these locations because they choose to be there. So they have a foundational draw to certain communities or certain regions around the world. when they're held hostage. I mean, it is something that is manipulating their mind and pushing back against their resistance posture day by day. And, it is understandable on how some of them start affiliating with some of the ideas that are being presented to them. And I certainly wouldn't pass judgment because they're victims. But there are famous cases. The Stockholm Syndrome, I actually stayed, it's a hotel now, it's a bank in Stockholm, Sweden. Just stayed there not long ago. Or a famous one is Patty Hearst with the Symbionese Liberation Army. That is really, she went from perhaps being a victim to robbing banks with a submachine gun and the Symbionese Liberation Army, which is very unique, and you can't imagine it, in modern day, but it could happen again, I'm sure.
Well, thanks for that, Chris. Amanda, I'm going to kick over to you because we're running out of time, right?
We are, and I want to apologize for all the questions we didn't get to, and they were wide-ranging and fascinating. I wish we had another hour, but we don't. I want to thank Chris O'Leary and Chris Costa for a really, really wide-ranging and fascinating conversation. Thank you both. And I want to thank our sponsor today, the Ironheart Warriors Foundation, for your generous support. We really appreciate it. This program will be up on our YouTube channel soon if you would like to watch it again, or if you would like to share it with your friends or colleagues. And we have a variety of virtual and in-person programs coming up. Please check out the Spy Museum online calendar to find out more and sign up. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today.